In the spring of 1945, a long and grueling island-hopping campaign was entering its final stage as the United States Navy rapidly closed in on mainland Japan in a determined drive across the Pacific. Still, before any effort to storm the shores of Japan, a last desperate battle lurked on the horizon. On April 1, 1945, the calm shores of Okinawa would become a witness to one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater of World War II, and a brutal 82-day fight that unfolded would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, while its deadly outcome would ultimately have far-reaching effects that will forever carve its mark in history. By the end of 1944, the war in the Pacific had progressed far beyond all expectations. The grand American drive across the vast expanse of the Pacific, which had begun with the landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942, and had, since November 1943 and the invasion of Tarawa, been following two main axes of advance, with one through the islands of the Central Pacific commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz, and the second that ran along the Southwest Pacific from the Solomon Islands across New Guinea, led by General Douglas MacArthur, gained momentum surging forward toward the heart of the Japanese Empire with constantly increasing acceleration, and these two axes were now rapidly closing in on each other. In early October, MacArthur's troops occupied Morotai, a crucial springboard for further invasion of the Philippines, while simultaneously Nimitz's forces, after securing vital bases for the long-range B-29 bombers on the Mariana Islands, got engaged in a bloody struggle for the island of Peleliu. Yet, as Americans progressed towards the heart of the empire, the Japanese, instead of showing any signs of crumbling, demonstrated with a fanatical tenacity and even greater determination not to give up ground and capitulate. In these circumstances, on September 29, 1944, Admiral Nimitz met with Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in San Francisco to confer about the next strategic target in advance on Japan. Throughout most of 1944, Army and Navy commanders in the Pacific Ocean areas had been planning an invasion of Formosa, codenamed Operation Causeway, scheduled to get underway in early 1945. The potential capture of Formosa had held significant strategic advantages, as it would provide air and naval bases close to China, from which the Allies could interrupt communication and supply lines between China and Japan, and at the same time, the island could serve as the springboard for a potential assault on the Chinese coast or the Japanese home islands. However, as planning progressed, the formidable challenges of invading Formosa became more apparent. The island, covered in mountains which rise to 4,000 meters high, was well within the range of Japanese air bases in China and heavily defended by the entire field army, much too strong to be attacked by American forces then available in the Pacific Ocean area, even if, after occupying the central Philippines, MacArthur's troops from the southwest Pacific area would bypass Luzon and get diverted to Formosa, which was part of the plan. It would still lack sufficient resources for the execution of Operation Causeway. Furthermore, based on previous experiences of recent fanatical Japanese resistance encountered at Marianas and Peleliu, the estimated casualty rate of what was likely to be a long and exhausting campaign was to go up to 150,000 men or more, and that was something the U.S. Army and Navy could not afford at this stage of the war. Even though initially Nimitz backed the invasion of Formosa, after consulting his senior commanders, he concluded that the invasion of Formosa was, due to the shortages of service and supporting troops, not feasible at that time. In the meantime, MacArthur strongly opposed the invasion of Formosa and most vigorously advocated the seizure of Luzon, believing that this island was a more valuable strategic prize than Formosa, and which, according to his estimates, could be recaptured with comparatively moderate casualties and in a relatively short time. Moreover, with the seizure of Luzon, the Americans would acquire ample air and naval bases in the Philippines, from which the Navy could block the Japanese shipping lanes in the China Sea, and in parallel, the Air Force could effectively neutralize Formosa. When Nimitz brought these facts to the attention of his superior, Admiral King, it became evident to both of them that the invasion of Formosa was not feasible without the redeployment of additional resources from Europe. Nevertheless, instead of Operation Causeway, Nimitz proposed an alternative plan. For some time, the Navy planners worked to find an appropriate substitute objective instead of Formosa, and the solution they came up with was to compensate it through a series of operations designed to maintain steady pressure against the Japanese, which might get carried out with the troops available to the Central Pacific area. Therefore, instead of a single, The plan was to launch twin amphibious operations on Okinawa, the largest island in the Ryukyu Islands, and Iwo Jima, an island in the Nanpo-Shoto Island chain. Thus, a few days later, Admiral King communicated Nimitz's perspective to the rest of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, after evaluating this subject on October 3, 1944, finally decided to postpone Operation Causeway and bypass Formosa, while, at the same time, they instructed General MacArthur to proceed with the invasion of Luzon in December and authorized Admiral Nimitz to execute operations on Iwo Jima and Okinawa early in 1945. All three operations were to go in succession, since they required the same Navy's covering force, air support, and amphibious and logistical resources. The operation on Luzon, scheduled for December 20th, would enable the Southwest Pacific Forces to maintain the offensive pressure against the Japanese, while the occupation of Iwo Jima, later in January, was to follow through with another blow aiming to secure bases for fighter planes on the island situated at the unique strategic location midway along the B-29 bombers' route from the Marianas to Tokyo, and from where the fighters were to rendezvous and escort the heavy bombers operating against Japan from their bases at the Marianas. The seizure of Okinawa, scheduled for March 1945, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was to penetrate the inner ring of Japanese defenses, cut their air and sea communications south through the Ryukyu Islands, and carry the war to the threshold of Japan. Furthermore, securing the bases on the Ryukyus would bring the Japanese home islands well within the range of medium bombers, and an estimated 780 bombers, together with the necessary number of fighters, could be stationed there, while an advanced fleet anchorage available on the archipelago and naval bases gained on Luzon would allow submarines to tighten the shipping blockade that would, combined with intensified air bombardment, destroy the Japanese military forces or their will to resist. Finally, the captured bases could also provide an adequate staging area for further operations in the region, including the invasion of Kyushu and subsequently Honshu, the industrial heart of Japan. The Ryukyus archipelago, also known as the Nansei-Shoto Islands, sits southwest of Japan, extending roughly 1,200 kilometers from Kyushu to Formosa and consisting of 161 islands, only 30 of which are large enough to sustain sizable populations. And these islands, arranged in the form of an arc, forms a natural boundary between the East China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Approximately in the center of the arc lies Okinawa, the largest island in the Ryukyu Islands chain. Generally extending from north to south, approximately 106 kilometers long and an average of 11 kilometers wide, with an area of 1,206 square kilometers, Okinawa, the main objective of Operation Iceberg, is positioned roughly 563 kilometers south of the main island of Kyushu, the southernmost of the four largest Japanese islands, and was large enough to support dozens of airfields, as well as dozens of divisions together with all manner of warships, made this island an ideal staging area for the impending attack on Japan. Like the other islands in the chain, Okinawa is entirely fringed with coral reefs and split in half by the Ishikawa Isthmus, the narrowest point with a width of little more than 3 kilometers, into two highly distinct areas. The northern part is highly rugged and mountainous, with a central ridge that rises more than 300 meters and runs through the length of the area covered by pine forests and a poor road network. At the same time, the southern half, where 3/4 of the 435,000 inhabitants lived, is the limestone plateau with a rolling, hilly country, much lower than the north, but broken by terraces, steep natural escarpments, and ravines, with almost every foot of usable land cut into small fields. The roads here were in much better condition, and it was also an area where the island's major towns, such as Naha, Shuri, Itoman, and Yonabaru, were located. The hills in the area were mainly aligned from east to west, and, as such, provided successive natural lines ideal for defense. The operation of seizing such a relatively big island as Okinawa and securing additional bases in the Ryukyus archipelago was, in many respects, the culmination of the experience of all previous operations in the Pacific War that brought together an aggregate of military power accumulated during more than 3 years of war in what was going to be a joint operation with the greatest concentration of land, sea, and air forces ever to be used in the Pacific, and in which planners took advantage of their work on the cancelled Formosa operation, adapting it to the needs of the Okinawa campaign. The beginning of operation was scheduled for March 1, 1945, and depended heavily upon the successful and timely capture of Iwo Jima by the 5th Amphibious Corps for the release of the naval artillery and close air support units for their availability to support the assault on Okinawa. Moreover, the Iwo Jima and Okinawa operations were so closely interconnected, sharing not only the same air and naval covering force, but also the same planning team that simultaneously developed strategies for both campaigns. Therefore, to avoid confusion with the more common D-Day designation used for Iwo Jima landings, the initial landing day on Okinawa was designated L-Day. From the outset of the planning process, Navy staff conceived Operation Iceberg as a massive undertaking that would ultimately be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and this critical mission Nimitz entrusted to the mighty Fifth Fleet, commanded by his trusted right hand since the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. By mid-March 1945, the Fifth Fleet was a formidable force comprising 40 aircraft carriers with 2,021 aircraft, 20 battleships, 31 cruisers, and 181 destroyers, along with numerous other amphibious, logistic, and support vessels subordinated, which formed the largest naval armada ever gathered in the Pacific, with over 1,300 ships. This massive joint Navy and Army task force was further divided into two main components: Naval Covering Forces designated as Task Force 50, under Spruance's direct command, and a Joint Expeditionary Force, Task Force 51, assigned to execute the landings and ground operations under Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of the Pacific Fleet's amphibious forces. In contrast to previous amphibious operations that Admiral Nimitz's forces had carried across the Pacific, and which had required relatively few ground forces, now, due to the proximity of the objective to the Japanese homeland and expected heavy resistance over a prolonged period, called for the employment of a field army. Therefore, under Admiral Turner's direction, Joint Expeditionary Troops designated Task Force 56, assigned to carry out ground operations on Okinawa for better operational leadership once ashore, was to come under a 10th Army Headquarters, commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. The 10th Army was a complex joint task force composed of a mixture of Army, Navy, and Marine units, formed out of the Army's 24th Corps under Major General John R. Hodge, consisting of 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, and Major General Roy S. Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps, composed of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, and, even though the 10th Army had been activated in the United States relatively recently in June 1944 and subsequently transferred to Hawaii, its units under were led by the experienced Corps commanders and were mainly composed of seasoned veterans who had been in action ever since Guadalcanal and Tarawa and had seen action in battles on the Marshalls, Marianas, Peleliu, and Leyte. Additional 3 divisions, the 27th and 77th Infantry and the 2nd Marine Division, were to be used for special operations or as the 10th Army Floating Reserve, while the 81st Infantry Division, stationed in New Caledonia, served as the Central Pacific Area's strategic reserve. These divisions, substantially reinforced by tank battalions, amphibian truck and tractor battalions, and many other attached service units, numbered about 183,000 troops available for the invasion, of which about 154,000 served in combat units, and the divisions committed for the initial landings totaled roughly 116,000 men. Furthermore, not only was the 10th Army a combination of the Army and Marine Corps, with attached a naval task group mainly formed of transport and supply ships, along with 18,000 Navy ground support troops, but its other unique feature was that it controlled its own tactical air force. Another distinct element of Operation Iceberg was that, unlike previous amphibious operations carried out across the Pacific, the objective now lay within the reach of Japanese aircraft based in Kyushu. Therefore, weeks before the invasion, Air Force B-29s from bases on the Marianas and the Fifth Fleet's main striking force, the formidable Task Force 58, also known as Fast Carrier Force, under Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, composed of 88 ships, including 11 fleet and 6 escort aircraft carriers, with over 1,400 aircraft, backed by 7 battleships, 18 cruisers and many more destroyers, and a massive logistics support group, were to commence the mission of softening and neutralizing Japanese air strength and defenses, not only on the Ryukyus, but on Kyushu and the rest of the Japanese home islands. In addition to the US fleet, Operation Iceberg was also to mark the first major deployment of the British fleet in the Pacific, designated as Task Force 57, commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings and equipped with 4 fast carriers carrying 244 aircraft and supported by battleships Howe and King George V. 5 cruisers and 11 destroyers, and this force operated as the Royal Navy's counterpart to the fast carrier force and operated semi-autonomously under Admiral Spruance's overall command. Following the strategic isolation of Okinawa by land and carrier-based aircraft, and after gaining local air superiority, 8 days before main landings, battleships and cruisers of Task Force 54, the Naval Gunfire and Covering Force, along with the Amphibious Support Force, Task Force 52, were to arrive in the target area and begin week-long pre-invasion naval bombardment of the island defenses and air installations, and provide cover and protection against the Japanese surface and air units. Meanwhile, minesweepers of the Amphibious Support Force were to clear the waters and the beaches of mines and demolish beach obstacles to ensure the safe and uninterrupted approach of the transports and the landings of the assault troops. After the landings, Task Force 54 and Task Force 52 were to furnish naval support and cover for the land operations. At about the same time, a week before the main landings, the units of the 77th Infantry Division were to take the 8 small rugged islands in the Kurama Group some 24 kilometers west to serve as anchorage for refueling and rearming, and sand islets of Kaisei-shima about 18 kilometers southwest for the positioning of long-range artillery. The main part of the ground operation was to go in 3 phases, and the first phase aimed at securing southern Okinawa, including the island's 2 main airfields at Yontan and Kadena. During the second phase, the American troops were to seize northern Okinawa and the adjacent island of Ieshima, and in the third phase, the 5th Amphibious Corps, after securing Iwo Jima, was supposed to seize the islands of Kikai-shima north of Okinawa and Miyako-shima near Formosa. But since the 5th Amphibious Corps suffered heavy casualties at Iwo Jima, this part of the plan was ultimately cancelled. The vast extent of Operation Iceberg required both corps of the 10th Army to land simultaneously, each with 2 divisions abreast. Therefore, finding a suitable site for an amphibious landing of such scale, large enough to sustain a force of 4 divisions and supporting units, proved challenging. Upon a thorough study of intelligence data acquired by aerial reconnaissance and captured Japanese maps, planning staff, after reviewing all available beaches in southern Okinawa, have chosen the west coast beaches lying to the north and south of the small town of Hagushi, which seemed to be the most suitable landing area. Moreover, not only was the terrain there more favorable for such a large amphibious operation than anywhere else on the island, but the proximity to key objectives, including Kadena and Yontan airfields, played an important role during the selection process. The final plan called for the 24th Corps to land the 96th Division, commanded by Major General James L. Bradley on the right, and the 7th Division, under Major General Archibald Arnold, on the left on the beaches south of Hagushi. Simultaneously, the 3rd Amphibious Corps was to land on its right flank the 1st Marine Division, better known by its famous nickname, the Old Breed, led by a new divisional commander, Major General Pedro A. Del Valle, who relieved Major General William Rupertus, who was given command over Marine Corps schools back in the United States, following his controversial leadership during the battle at Peleliu, while the 6th Marine Division under Major General Lemuel Shepard Jr. was to land opposite Yontan Airfield, on the 3rd Amphibious Corps' left flank. While the troops were landing on the west coast, the 2nd Marine Division was to feint landings on the southeast coast, and this demonstration was to be repeated on the second day as realistically as possible in order to deceive the Japanese into believing that landings would be made there as well as on the Hagushi beaches. These feinted landings were also used in previous operations in the Pacific Theater, and its results were, to say at least, questionable. After establishing a secure beachhead, both corps were to drive across the island in a coordinated advance. In the 3rd Amphibious Corps' zone of operation, the 6th Marine Division was to capture the Yontan airfield before advancing further towards the Ishikawa Isthmus, the narrow neck of the island, to protect the northern flank of the 10th Army, while the 1st Marine Division was to head down the Kachin Peninsula on the east coast. At the same time, the 24th Corps' 7th Division was to seize the Kadena airfield and push to the east coast to cut the island in 2, and the 96th Division, advancing on its right flank, was required initially to capture the high ground commanding its beaches on the south and southeast before rushing down the coastal road to protect the 10th Army's southern flank. The planners anticipated it to take 10 days of hard fighting to secure the center of the island and cut it in half before the 24th Corps proceeded with its main task of clearing the southern part of Okinawa, advancing with the 7th Division on the east and the 96th Division along the west coast, while the 3rd Amphibious Corps was to seize northern part of the island, spearheaded by 6th Marine Division and backed by the 1st Marine Division. Due to delays in the operation on Luzon and the unexpected ferocity of resistance encountered on Iwo Jima, the start date of Operation Iceberg was postponed twice, first to late March and then unfavorable weather conditions forced a further delay. Ultimately, the L-Day was finally set for April 1st, 1945. Meanwhile, in parallel with the operational planning, the Navy intelligence staff worked hard to gather information about Japanese strength on the island. The initial estimate from October 1944 projected that the Okinawa garrison, numbering some 48,600 men, while a later revision from January 1945 raised this number to 55,000, with the expectation that the Japanese would reinforce the Okinawa garrison to 66,000 by April 1, 1945, and this figure included 2.5 infantry divisions. In the worst-case scenario, intelligence officers estimated that defense forces could reach up to 87,000 men, with 4 infantry divisions constituting the principal combat elements. The troop dispositions, studied in the light of Japanese tactical doctrine as it had evolved throughout the war, indicated that they would most likely organize a defense in depth in the southern third of the island and withhold the bulk of their troops in mobile reserve. They also anticipated that the Japanese would defend the beaches from prepared positions and commit its reserve to a counter-offensive as soon as they had clarified the dispositions of the landing force. It's needless to say, they were wrong. For the first 2 years of the war, only a small and poorly trained garrison with inadequate coastal and anti-aircraft artillery defended Okinawa. However, as early as the spring of 1944, the Japanese military leadership had recognized that the tide of the war in the Pacific was shifting in American favor, and that Okinawa would likely be one of the crucial targets in the Allied advance towards mainland Japan. Thus, as a first step to strengthen the defense of this strategic island, on April 1, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army formed the 32nd Army with headquarters at Okinawa under the command of Lieutenant General Masao Watanabe, which was part of the 10th Area Army stationed on Formosa. Following the American successes in the campaign at the Marianas, in the summer of 1944, the Imperial General Headquarters formed a new defense perimeter, which extended from Formosa through Okinawa to Iwo Jima, focusing the main defensive effort on the Ryukyus archipelago. And so during and after the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the major reinforcements began pouring into the island. The first reinforcement to reach Okinawa was the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, or at least only its tiny fragment, which arrived late in June. While en route to Okinawa, the convoy carrying this brigade, originally formed out of 2 regimental-size infantry units with a total strength of around 6,000 men, was on June 23, 1944, intercepted by the American submarine USS Sturgeon, which had sent the troop transport ship Toyama Mara to the bottom of Pacific, along with more than 5,000 men. Though it had never recovered to its former strength, by the time the Americans stormed the shores of Okinawa, the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade had been reinforced and rebuilt around a core of about 600 survivors. By August, no less than 4 infantry divisions, the 9th, the 24th, the 28th, and the 62nd, had poured into the island. However, as soon as the 28th Division landed on Okinawa, it was transferred to the island of Sakishima Guntu, though it remained under the 32nd Army's command. At the same time, in August 1944, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima relieved General Watanabe, succeeding the command over the 32nd Army. Shortly after General Ushijima took over the 32nd Army, he hurled himself with utmost seriousness into transforming this long island into an ocean fortress. Given that the 32nd Army possessed the resources to defend only approximately 1/3 of the island, Ushijima had to decide where to set up his defenses. The island's rugged half, north of Ishikawa Isthmus, although offering favorable defensive terrain, was swiftly ruled out as an option because of the insufficient road network for the efficient transportation of supplies to the front lines. Therefore, he decided to deploy the bulk of his force to the southern part of the island. However, considering that command of the 10th Area Army, to which the 32nd Army was subordinate, insisted that Ushijima follow the plan for the ground defense of Okinawa established in July 1944, which outlined the intention to destroy the Americans at the water's edge and centering the island's defense on the central plain for the protection of Kadena and Yontan airfields. He had little choice but comply. so as a result, he stationed the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade there. Amidst the preparations for the island's defense, in late November, Ushijima's best division, the veteran 9th Division, was ordered to transfer to the Philippines, severely weakening the 32nd Army and leaving Ushijima to organize defense with only 2 divisions and an understrength brigade. Though it was supposed to be replaced by the 84th Infantry Division, the Imperial Army headquarters cancelled this move, considering it too risky to send such a large number of troops by the sea in the face of the American submarine offensive. This sudden withdrawal of 14,000 combat troops indicated a change in the 32nd Army's defensive strategy. After consulting his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, and his Deputy Commander, Lieutenant General Hiromichi Yahara, who played key roles in shaping the defense strategy, Ushijima concluded that it was impossible to defeat the Americans with troops available, and that the most that they could do was to deny the invaders the use of the island for as long a period as possible and inflict the maximum number of casualties. Therefore, he abandoned all efforts to meet Americans at the water's edge. Instead, he adopted the tactics of an in-depth defense further inland, attempting to bleed the invaders as heavily as possible, forcing them to fight for every meter of the ground on his terms in a war of attrition, utilizing the same approach already encountered by the U.S. Army troops on Biak and Marines on Peleliu. According to a new defensive arrangement endorsed by Cho and Ushijima on January 15, 1945, Ushijima drew his forces together into the southern part of Okinawa, and in the final troop deployment, the 62nd Division held a strongly fortified zone of resistance in an area around Shuri, dug into the successive positions in a defensive belt which formed main battle line designed to inflict maximum casualties on the Americans. At the same time, the 24th Division took positions extending across the southern end of the island, while the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade moved to the Chinin Peninsula from where it was to cooperate with the 24th. The 27th Tank Regiment, formed out of 1 light and 1 medium tank company, a tractor-drawn artillery battery, and an infantry company, was deployed as a mobile reserve. Though attention was mainly directed towards the south, the island's north was not entirely abandoned. The 1st Specially Established Regiment, formed from airfield service personnel, protected Kadena and Yontan airfields on the Central Plain, and the 2 reinforced battalions detached from the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, composing the 2nd Infantry Unit, was positioned on Motobu Peninsula on the island's northwest coast, with one of its battalions guarded Ieshima. Instead of fixed fortification to distract and tie up more American forces, these units were instructed to utilize guerrilla tactics. For months, the Japanese soldiers were working hard to fortify the main zone of defense in a series of concentric positions adapted to the favorable terrain features, building skillfully camouflaged emplacements, blockhouses and pillboxes, and carving them into the hills, caves and escarpments, connecting them by elaborate underground tunnels. The Japanese took full advantage of the terrain to organize defensive areas and position mutually supporting strongpoints, and they also fortified many local burial tombs, as well as the reverse and the forward slopes of hills. In its final form, these fortifications resembled the blood-soaked caves on Peleliu and the tunnels of Iwo Jima. These formidable fortifications were backed by artillery and mortars and thoroughly integrated into the general scheme of defensive fire. The 32nd Army's artillery was instructed not to fire on the invading ships and landing forces to avoid revealing its positions and exposing them to devastating American naval gunfire. The infantry was ordered not to launch any counterattack against landings in their sectors, since Ushijima did not want to go out to meet the invaders. Instead, he intended to wait for them to come to him and force them to fight on his own terms. The 32nd Army Command included not only infantry, artillery, Army air and ground units, but also approximately 10,000 naval personnel, primarily from the Okinawa Naval Base Force and other maintenance or construction units, commanded by Rear Admiral Minoru Ota, who adopted a policy of complete cooperation with Army. In addition to the armed forces, by the time of the American landings on Okinawa, about 20,000 men had been mobilized into rear echelon labor and service troops known as Boeitai or Home Guard. Although these men were largely unarmed, they played a valuable role in supporting the combat troops by carrying ammunition and supplies to the front, and were also engaged in numerous front-line and rear area construction, as well as various other duties, and some eventually saw combat. By late March 1945, the total strength of the 32nd Army amounted to more than 100,000 men, including the 20,000 Boitai draftees and an unknown number of conscripted Okinawans, drafted into Japanese Army after the departure of the 9th Infantry Division, and regardless of how well trained or armed these men were, not one of them had the intention to surrender. In parallel with the 32nd Army's defensive preparations, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Air Force made their own plans, and this combined Navy and Air Force plan was dubbed Tengo. Tengo was a straightforward plan that called for massive air attacks by aircraft swarming from Japanese home islands and Formosa. In early 1945, the Japanese had massed more than 3,000 aircraft at Kyushu and 300 to 400 additional planes on Formosa, of which over 1,500 were kamikaze. Introduced in October 1944 at the beginning of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, these rudimentary and desperate new weapons were, in fact, fighter planes converted into suicide bombers that aimed to crash dive on U.S. Navy ships. Between the first organized kamikaze attack over the Philippines and March 1945, the tactics of these suicide attacks evolved significantly, and new weapons such as Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka suicide rockets were mass-produced. Furthermore, in addition to kamikaze, the Navy introduced suicide boats armed with 2 depth charges that were to attack American ships, and more than 350 of these boats were stationed on the Kurama Islands next to Okinawa. Therefore, the defense of Okinawa can best be summarized by the 32nd Army's slogan composed by Ushijima: 1 plane for 1 warship, 1 boat for 1 ship, 1 man for 10 of the enemy, or 1 tank.